Luciano, by name of Charles Luciano, original name Salvatore Lucania, born November 11, 1896, Lercara, Sicily, Italy, died January 26, 1962, Naples, the most powerful chief of American organized crime in the early 1930s and a major influence even from prison in 1936-45 and after deportation to Italy in 1946. Luciano emigrated with his parents from Sicily to New York City in 1906 and at the age of 10 was already involved in mugging, shoplifting, and extortion. In 1916 he spent 6 months in jail for selling heroin. Out of jail, he teamed up with Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky and other young gangsters. He earned his nickname Lucky for success at evading arrest and winning craps games. In 1920 he joined the ranks of New York's rising crime boss, Joe Masseria, and by 1925 he had become Masseria's chief lieutenant, directing bootlegging, prostitution, narcotics distribution, and other rackets. In October 1929 he became the rare gangster to survive a one-way ride. He was abducted by 4 men in a car, beaten, stabbed repeatedly with an ice pick, had his throat slit from ear to ear, and was left for dead on a Staten Island beach, but survived. He never named his abductors. Soon after, he changed his name to Luciano. The bloody gang war of 1930-31 between Masseria and rival boss Salvatore Maranzano was anathema to Luciano and other young racketeers who decried the publicity and loss of business, money, and efficiency. On April 15, 1931, Luciano lured Masseria to a Coney Island restaurant and had him assassinated by 4 loyalists, Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis, and Bugsy Siegel. 6 months later, on September 10, he had Maranzano murdered by 4 Jewish gunmen loaned by Meyer Lansky. Luciano had carefully nurtured his contacts with all the young powers in gangdom and had become boss of all bosses, capo di tutti capi or capo di tutti I capi, without ever accepting or claiming the title. By 1934 he and the leaders of other crime families had developed the National Crime Syndicate or cartel. Then, in 1935, New York Special Prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey bore down on Luciano, gathering evidence of his brothel and call girl empire and related extortion. In 1936 he was indicted, tried, and convicted and was sentenced to Clinton Prison at Dannemora, New York, for a 30 to 50-year term. From his cell Luciano continued to rule and issue orders. In 1942, after the luxury liner Normandy blew up in New York Harbor, Navy intelligence sought Luciano's help in tightening waterfront security. The crime syndicate's power extended to the Longshoremen's Union. Luciano gave the orders, sabotage on the docks ended, and in 1946 his sentence was commuted, and he was deported to Italy, where he settled in Rome. In 1947 he moved to Cuba, to which all the syndicate heads came to pay homage and cash. But the pressure of public opinion and the U.S. Narcotics Bureau forced the embarrassed Cuban regime to deport him. He ended up in Naples, where he continued to direct the drug traffic into the United States and the smuggling of aliens to America. He died of a heart attack at Capodichino Airport in Naples in 1962 and was buried in St. John's Cathedral Cemetery, Queens, New York. Charlie Luciano got an STD on purpose to dodge the draft. Charlie Lucky Luciano was one of the lawless kings of his time and remained so even after his eventual deportation. Various biographers have struggled to sum up his life, and in doing so numerous colorful stories of varying levels of truth have cropped up about the man. One story about how he dodged the draft in World War I is perhaps the most bizarre. At 19, Luciano was petrified that his finances would be lost should he be shipped overseas. In an attempt to dodge the draft, his friends advised him that a hearty case of the clap should do the trick and allow him to stay at home. At first Luciano strongly resisted the idea, telling his friends in no uncertain terms what they could do to themselves. Eventually, his young friend Bugsy Siegel convinced him and pointed him in the direction of a lady of the evening. and so Luciano avoided the draft, though at a painful cost. Frank Costello, original name Francesco Costiglia, born January 26, 1891, Cosenza, Italy, died February 18, 1973, New York, New York, U.S., major American syndicate gangster, a close associate of Lucky Luciano, noted for his influence with politicians. Arriving in New York City at the age of 4 with his immigrant Calabrian parents, Costello grew up in East Harlem and became head of the 104th Street Gang, a group of young Italian hoodlums. In 1915 he went to prison for a year for carrying a concealed weapon. On release he allied himself with Lucky Luciano and, in the course of the 1920s, branched into bootlegging and gambling operations in New York, Florida, Louisiana, and other states. In 1931, after the death of crime bosses Giuseppe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano, Costello became the syndicate's political link and Luciano's closest aide, quietly taking over his syndicate interests when the boss of bosses was deported to Italy in 1946. He also gathered interests in Las Vegas gambling casinos and socialized with New York politicians and businessmen. In 1951 Costello began his long battle with the U.S. government. Refusing to answer certain questions during public hearings of the U.S. Senate investigating committee headed by Estes Kefauver, he was cited for contempt and sentenced to 18 months in prison. He was thereafter convicted of income tax evasion and received another 5 years. Out on bail briefly in 1957, he had to contend with another threat, from his major rival for supremacy in New York's crime cartel, Vito Genovese. On the night of May 2, 1957, Costello was shot in his hotel lobby by a Genovese gunman, allegedly Vincente Gigante, but survived. That same year he was convicted again, for contempt of a grand jury, and for the next several years served out his several sentences, obtaining release on June 20, 1961, but losing U.S. citizenship that same year. His power in the syndicate was through, even after Genovese's death in 1969, when Costello reluctantly moved to try to provide leadership for the foundering New York rackets. His role was limited to advice and arbitration of disputes, far removed from day-to-day operations. He died of a heart attack at age 82. Meyer Lansky, original name Meyer Szalionski, born July 4, 1902, officially assigned date by U.S. authorities, Grodno, also spelled Grodna, Russian Empire, now in Belarus, died January 15, 1983, Miami Beach, Florida, U.S., one of the most powerful and richest of U.S. crime syndicate chiefs and bankers. He had major interests in gambling, especially in Florida, pre-Castro Cuba, Las Vegas, and the Bahamas. A Polish Jew born in the Russian Pale of Settlement, Lansky immigrated with his parents to New York's Lower East Side in 1911. By 1918 he and the American gangster Bugsy Siegel were running a floating crap game and then graduated into highly lucrative auto theft and resale. In the course of the 1920s Lansky's gang branched into burglaries, liquor smuggling, and other rackets and came under the aegis of crime boss Giuseppe Masseria. Lansky and Siegel had also developed a squad of professional murderers for hire, the prototype for the later Murder Incorporated, headed by Louis Buchalter and Albert Anastasia. Lansky became a naturalized citizen in 1928. It was allegedly Lansky who persuaded the Italian-born crime boss Lucky Luciano to have Masseria assassinated in 1931 and provided Siegel's services for that purpose, making the four-man hit team representative of the major New York crime factions. Between 1932 and 1934 Lansky joined Luciano and the American gangster Johnny Torrio, among others, in forming the National Crime Syndicate and became one of its major overseers and bankers, often laundering funds through foreign accounts. By 1936 Lansky had begun to develop gambling operations in Florida and New Orleans and also in Cuba, where he arranged payoffs to Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista. He also financed Siegel's casino developments in Las Vegas, and ordered Siegel's execution in 1947, after Siegel welched on the syndicate. When Fidel Castro came to power in Cuba in 1959, Lansky turned to the Bahamas, building casinos on Grand Bahama and Paradise Islands in the 1960s after nurturing government cooperation. He also extended his gambling empire to other areas of the Caribbean and even across the Atlantic to London. He was involved in narcotics smuggling, pornography, prostitution, labor racketeering, and extortion, and had control of such legitimate enterprises as hotels, golf courses, and a meat packing plant. Monies were secreted in Swiss banks. By 1970 his total holdings were estimated at $300 million. In 1970, fearing both a call to a grand jury and indictment for income tax evasion, he fled to Israel, seeking to remain under the law of return. However, Israel eventually expelled him, and he ended up back in the United States facing several indictments. In 1973 he was convicted of contempt of a grand jury, a verdict overturned on appeal, but acquitted of income tax evasion. Indictments on other charges were abandoned in 1974, partly because of his chronic ill health. In 1979 the House of Representatives Assassinations Committee, ending its 2-year investigation of the Warren Commission report, linked Lansky with Jack Ruby, the nightclub owner who killed U.S. President John F. Kennedy's assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald. Joseph Valachi, in full Joseph Michael Valachi, born September 22, 1903, New York, New York, U.S. died April 3, 1971, La Tuna Federal Correctional Institution, Texas, American gangster, member of Lucky Luciano's mob family, who turned informer in 1962. Valachi held a rank in the mafia equivalent to that of a sergeant, with interests chiefly in the numbers rackets and other gambling from the 1930s to the 50s. In 1959 he was convicted of narcotics violations and sentenced to 15 to 20 years in prison. In June 1962, in the federal prison at Atlanta, Georgia, crime boss Vito Genovese, a fellow inmate, suspecting him, incorrectly, of having become an informer, gave him the kiss of death, a sign that he was to be killed. Valachi panicked, killed a fellow prisoner who he mistakenly thought was his assassin, and, in revenge against the death threat, told all to the U.S. Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, the FBI, the Justice Department, and the U.S. Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, headed by John L. McClellan. Valachi was the first syndicate member ever to describe the history, membership, and inner workings of the national crime cartel popularly called the Mafia, what Valachi termed Cosa Nostra, our thing. Robert Kennedy called his testimony the biggest single intelligence breakthrough yet in combating organized crime and racketeering in the United States. Investigations, indictments, and convictions followed Valachi's testimony.